So I hope we are ready to begin. My name is Martin Wolf, and I have the great honor and pleasure of moderating this really important panel with very distinguished participants. And our subject is very timely and globally important, which is the North-South schism. And before I introduce the discussion, I just very briefly wish to introduce the panelists, though I think they are sufficiently famous that you will know who they all are. Immediately to my left is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's Director General of the World Trade Organization and a member of the Board of Trustees of this distinguished institution. To her left is Gustavo Petro, who's President of Colombia. To his left is Paul Kagame, who's President of Rwanda. To his left is William H. Gates, or Bill Gates, as most of us know him, who is, among many other things, co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And finally, to his left is Mark Rutte, Prime Minister of the Netherlands. And we're going to proceed. We won't be doing Q&A, we won't have time. We're going to discuss first the overarching problem of governance. Each of them will make a short contribution to that. And then we're going to have specific interventions on four big themes: trade, finance, health, and climate. And after that, if everybody's been very good at time, we will have the opportunity to have an interchange amongst us. I just thought I'd make a minute's worth of introduction, because for me, this is a very, very interesting topic. There are many disadvantages of becoming older, but one of them is that you remember things that are relevant. When I started working at the World Bank in 1971, this was right at the beginning of the 70s. And this seems to me a period which has some similarities. Not only were there the oil shocks, the war in the Middle East, inflation, and all the instability associated with these things, we also had an institution or grouping called the Group of 70, and they were arguing very, very powerfully for a new international economic order. This was a North-South schism. And one, I won't go further, but one very interesting book at that time, which was published in the middle of the 70s, was called The United States in Opposition. Of course, you know that what subsequently happened in the 80s and 90s was not a new international economic order, but the era of globalization. And we now feel at the end of that. But I think it is important to remember that we have seen problems like this before, and we have managed them really successfully, and it is immensely important that we do, though of course our challenges today include things like climate and health, which were less obvious then. And we also have to say that over the last 50 years, there has been staggering progress in development, which of course is now significantly troubled. So with that introduction, let me ask the panelists in order to make their brief comments on what is, from their perspective, the governance problem today in this context of North-South relations. And may I start with you, President Kagame.
Well, thank you very much. Let me address this by starting with the two crises that define the pessimism in the South about this international cooperation. One is when COVID happened. One is COVID, another is what happened with inflation and interest rates, the interest rate crisis that followed. With the COVID, it was clear that access to vaccines and therapeutics had a problem, and it was mainly concentrated in the north. The south was to be considered much later, even then very slowly, nearly too late, because the South did not have this capacity to produce their own vaccines or therapeutics. And then, coupled with many years of fiscal stimulus by the West, we saw that they developed an inflation crisis. And the response to that was to raise interest rates, which really many in the South are still paying a very high price for. Now, we cannot address this inequality by just mitigating the crisis, but rather we need to integrate, to bring in, to involve developing countries like Africa and other developing countries from the beginning, to have the conversations around how these inequalities should not be developing and later on affecting the particular parts of the world. So it has to be from the beginning. It's not just at the time when crises have happened that then you start making consideration of what to do for the South, but rather they should be involved. And Africa should be given and should be tools that are there, that are available to actually work on some of these things that are needed to be addressed. And Africa will therefore stand to gain and have access to most of these things required.
Thank you very much. That's very clear and very helpful in this discussion. May I turn to you, Prime Minister Rutte, for your perspective, perhaps partly in response, but what do you think are the really big issues in this context that we now face?
But let me be slightly provocative. I think for all of us, being the President of Rwanda or Colombia, Prime Minister of the Netherlands, we have basically two tasks. One is to make sure that our countries are safe, and secondly, make sure that the economy is doing well and that people have a job and can take care of their own lives. In that sense, I have a bit of an issue with constantly talking about the schism, the divide between the North and the South. I hope we are moving beyond that now, because we need each other. And we have seen so in Dubai at the COP28 that you can do that even successfully. And that would be my second comment. There is constantly this debate, also in my country, between multinationalism. Should we stay a member of the EU and the role of WTO and the UN, etc., as if that is something you can oppose to being interested in the national level. You cannot be a politician working at a national level, taking care of the national interest, if you are not part of a strong multilateral system. And that means that that strong multilateral system, we have to invest in it. It has to be rules-based. We have to make sure that we have enough discussions and talks on how to progress it, like the WTO, which has had some difficulty, but under the current leadership, I'm happy to say we see progress in a number of important fields. So there is not a schism between North and South, I would argue, for this debate. There is not a schism between the national level and multilateralism. If we want to be strong politicians and providing the jobs, providing the collective safety and security at the national level, we need both strong countries and strong multilateral organizations. And I think in following on this first round, Martin, I think we have many subjects and examples of where we are successfully doing that, be it fisheries in the WTO, to even getting an agreement on loss and damage at COP28 in Dubai. We have done that.
Thank you very much for that. Now it's your turn, Director General.
Well, thank you, Martin, and it's very nice to say thank you for the kind comments of Prime Minister Rutte and the progress at the WTO. But I just want to build on what President Kagame and Prime Minister Rutte said, to say that if we look at some numbers of what is happening in terms of shares of global output in the world, we see that, in 1995, emerging markets and developing economies accounted for about 42% of global output, of global GDP, and developed countries for about 58%. And now, in 2022, we see a situation where this is inverted. And so these changing shares of world output, and we see it mirrored also in some of the shares of trade, which I'll come back to later, speak to the multipolarity of the world, that we are now in a multipolar world. There's no one power center. And what worries me in global governance is how we manage this multipolarity. There's no one center that can solve all the problems of the world. We are interdependent, and we need to work together. And that speaks to the issue of how do we do it. And this is where multilateral organizations need to be strengthened, of course, need to be reformed to move with the times they're in. But we absolutely need them because we have to solve some problems of the global commons like climate change, you alluded to it, the pandemic that President Kagame talked about. And that, how do we manage this to solve global problems, this multipolarity? That's my issue.
Thank you very much. And I think we're getting to so far, a certain degree of agreement, which may I now ask President Gustavo Petro to make his contribution. He will be talking in Spanish. For those who don't understand it, unfortunately, I'm one of them. You might need to use the headphones.
Bien, gracias.
Thank you so much.
Hace un año,
1 year
creo
ago,
que en esto me separo un poco de Marco.
and I think I will distance myself a little bit from Mark. There's not a single path. There are two open paths. We are actually moving in this path of a schism between North and South. However, there is another pathway, this agreement, an agreement between equals. And a year ago, this forum,
Sorry, I'm afraid I'm not
this
getting
forum,
sound. Are you all getting sound?
are you getting the translation?
This is
Number one, Martin.
it's number one, yes?
Yeah.
Can you hear the translation now, sir? Can you hear the translation now, sir? This is the translation. This is the English channel. This is the English channel.
I apologize. I don't know what I can do about it.
Gracias. El tema es
Well, the issue is,
que hace un año
a year ago, this forum coined a word, polycrisis. We talked about the war, we talked about famine that waged the world as a result of the pandemic, as a result of diseases, poverty, and economic stagnation. Today,
después de un año,
after 1 year, the situation has become worse in terms of the fact that from war we have moved into genocide, bombarding children. Voting in the United Nations around this problem have divided physically and politically the North from the South. Europe and the US have voted in favor or against, depending on how you look at it, of a policy to solve the problem of Palestine, and there is a real political divide. The issue of vaccines was also a divide in terms of care for life in the north and in the south. We were imposed a commercial relationship to save the lives of COVID patients. And what we see today is a crisis of civilization, not only a crisis, but a crisis of civilization that has its origin in the climate crisis, because depending on how we tackle the climate or not tackle the climate crisis will lead to a democratic agreement among humankind or to a situation of barbarism. I call it the new 933, which is the year when Hitler raised to power. We could choose between the two paths, and the choice is there to be made. The economic, political, and social world paradigm is changing. The very human existence is being questioned, and with that, we question everything that was built around in the last 50 years for the better or worse. For instance, the concept of cooperation, which is one of the topics of this panel discussion. Cooperation is a concept that was built with the idea of a very wealthy north and a very poor south, and the idea of bringing money from north to south, and I call that charity, and the idea that the North was helping the South. And this is being placed at the center of the climate crisis. It is thought that the climate crisis will be overcome if there is a charity or an alm given by the North to the South. Those millions that were promised in 2015 in Paris, for instance. So this paradigm of cooperation, this idea of cooperation, crashes against the reality of the world civilization crisis, not only because these figures are much bigger than those 100 billion a year decided in Paris that we consider a handout, but also because what is needed to overcome the climate crisis, which is at the essence of today's crisis, is not only that. Chimneys are in the north. Let me explain it. CO2 chimneys, or CO2 pumping chimneys are in the north. So what it takes now is to stop this fume stacks. We need to put them off. And if we don't put off the smokestacks, we will be choking and bringing to extinction the forests in the south that absorb all this CO2. So from a technological and political standpoint, the North needs to change radically to sustain life in the planet. And it's the South that needs to help the North in that purpose. It's the other way around. Why? Because Africa and South America are the regions with a higher potential in generating clean energies across the planet. This changes the world geopolitics completely. We are the ones who can generate clean energy with which the smokestacks of the North will be able to put off their fires. So we need to cooperate with the North. And further ahead, we will be able to talk about what it means in terms of changing power relationships across the world.
Thank you very much. That's a really valuable contribution. I hope somebody would talk in that way. Finally, Bill Gates, your response or points.
Well, there's no doubt we find ourselves at a juncture where the demand for resources exceeds the resources available. And the needs coming out of Ukraine, the Middle East, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, so many things, including basic development, healthcare systems, education systems, all of these, the needs are pretty incredible. And I'd say there's three things we can do to improve that situation that we have a shortage. The first is we should try and be more generous. Those who have the most, whether it's countries, companies, or individuals, should be pushed to be more generous. You know, for example, in the aid category, getting up to 0.7%, or like Sweden and Norway, getting even beyond, you know, that's imperative. The second thing is to focus in on the highest impact areas where a dollar of resources is effective. I would say that there's almost a factor of 100 difference between some initiatives versus others, and we really need to study that and do well. And foremost in that is going to the countries, including in Africa, and saying, what are your priorities? You know, health, nutrition, education, where would you like to have these partnerships focus? The final area is innovation. There's been far too little innovation on the needs of the global south, whether it's malaria, whether it's their crops that go way beyond the big three, rice, wheat, and maize. They have unique ecosystems, and the amount we put into improving that agricultural productivity is dramatically less than it should be. I'll just finish with one example that should remind us that the system of cooperation sometimes achieves miracles. Gavi was announced here at Davos in 2001. It raised money to buy vaccines. Of course, Ngozi was a great chairman for that, and everyone here has had some engagement with Gavi, I think, that we're all proud of. And at that time, over 10 million children died every year. And largely because of getting these vaccines, which were only available in the rich country, getting them out to all the children. You know, Rwanda is an exemplar with a 97% coverage rate. Those deaths have been reduced to 5 million a year. The Sustainable Development Goals have, which are timed for 2030, have a goal of getting that to 2.5 million. Because of the pandemic and many other things, we won't achieve that. But the question is, do we keep going down? Do we get there during the 2030s or not? With the right prioritization, with taking innovation, including the latest AI innovation, I think despite all these challenges, we can still do that.
Okay, we've slightly overrun, but we'll do our best. Could we turn very, very quickly, and I think please keep these remarks to a minute each, just very pointed. What, on the basis of what you've heard, does this mean for the future of trade?
Wow. Well, will you, I just need, again, just a minute to illustrate what I want to talk about with some numbers.
Okay.
I come back to the issue. In 1995, North-North trade between the developed economies accounted for about 54% of global trade. In 2022, this has come down to 39%. During the same period, that's in 1995, South-South trade was less than 10%. In 2022, it's now almost 25%. In the same period, North-South trade has been stable at about 35% or more, or so, 39% actually. So if you look at these numbers, you will see again some of the inversion that I was talking about, that the shares, South-South trade, the South is now trading much more with itself, becoming a power bloc. The North share is diminishing. And it comes back to the issue I spoke about different centers of power, that there's no one center of power, and that we need to cooperate. But that being said, we find that at an organization like the WTO, where the global trading system comes together, the multilateral trading system, we've managed to cooperate. 75% of world trade today is done on WTO terms. Just think about that. The bulk of world trade is still done on multilateral terms. So even though we have this multipolar world and these power blocks, we've managed to find a place where we can collaborate, cooperate, and deliver, just like Bill had said about there are places where we've been able to demonstrate that we can work together. So on the trade front, we're doing that. That does not mean that we don't have issues, that we don't have emerging fragmentation, that we don't have vulnerability of supply chains, the need to build resilience. But we often forget the good parts of what's happening in trade and that cooperation in favor of the worries about protectionism and about unilateral actions. So I wanted to put a marker on that.
Thank you very much. May I turn to you, President Petro? I'd like you, if you could, to just very briefly indicate, based on your radical and critical view of what's going on, how, and I know you'd much rather have half an hour, but unfortunately they don't give us that, to how do you change the global financial arrangements? President Kagame has already referred to the interest rate shock and the impact that has had on developing countries. There are many issues here: debt, how the IMF works, the monetary dominance of the developed countries. Just focus on what seems to you to be really important.
Bien, sí.
Thank you. I may continue with what I said earlier on. If we look at the chimneys in the north that contribute to the climate crisis and the potential of clean energy in the south, when it comes to cooperation, this system of handouts from north to south, this cannot help us resolve the issue. We need to free the potential in the south to resolve this. Perhaps delocalization of production from north to south, or perhaps freeing the potential of the south to generate clean energy and to put out the chimneys in the north. And this entails changing the whole financial system. For instance, the WTO has to subject their efforts to the Paris Agreement. This should be binding and not just a will or an expression of goodwill. If we do not change this and take into account climate change, we won't be able to do so. In the financial system, we could free the potential of the South to generate clean energy and to decarbonize our economies. And this means liberating our own resources. We don't need any handouts. We do have our own resources, but our resources currently are subjected to debt and to these interest rates that we have to pay. For instance, Colombia pays a premium because we are considered to be at risk, such as Brazil or Ecuador or any other countries within the Amazon region. But we don't suppose a risk in the Amazon. It's rather the countries in the north that pose a threat to the Amazon. And you pose a greater threat to life. We are managing to absorb CO2 emissions. Therefore, this premium should be zero. And if there is no premium, our debt will drop. And therefore, we will free our resources. And instead of paying that debt, we can invest that on climate action. And if we do this for the whole planet and we reform the whole financial system, we will free the potential in the south so that we can generate clean energy and put out the chimneys in the north. So this is the path to reaching an agreement and not the path to a further schism. Otherwise, we raise walls and throw bombs. currently there is a schism. On the other hand, there is a political agreement in our humankind that we can achieve.
You are the next speaker, Prime Minister Rutte, and I think as you and your chimneys are the source of the risk in the world, though I think the Netherlands has fairly few chimneys now, but I might be wrong on that. So how do you respond on climate, and specifically on which the President has been very challenging, and he's absolutely right. There's no doubt the Amazon mega region is immensely important.
It's always good to have the Colombian president on the panel, and I'm always willing to oppose his views if necessary, but I do not disagree completely, because I agree with him on the necessity to reform the multilateral banking system. He's absolutely right on that, in that sense. But I fundamentally disagree on his chimney point and the handouts. And why is that? Because if we, for example, in the Netherlands, would close down our steel mill in IJmuiden, which employs 10,000 people directly and 40,000 people indirectly, there is this risk of a huge carbon leakage to other parts of the world, because that steel is still necessary. And Tata will then produce that somewhere else. So what we need here is innovation, to make ourselves less dependent on particular types of products, for example, from the chemical industries. But innovation is the key here, not closing down the chimneys altogether. And the second thing where I disagree is on the handouts. It's not handouts. There is a phasing issue, because the South is developing rapidly, in Africa, in Latin America, everywhere. But at this moment, there is still an issue to comply with the Paris Agreement, to make sure that we can bridge the gap. And that is why the $100 billion pledge was created. That is why we had an agreement in Dubai on loss and damage, and I think that is very good. And it will help us to really move forward, and I see him nodding yes, so he is letting go of his previous position and agreeing with me. That's good. No, I'm kidding. But now, to sum up, I think when we talk about multilateralism, and the WTO is a case in point, because it is not easy at this moment to deal with world trade. But for example, on fisheries subsidies, we have been able to come to agreements. And there are other subjects, and there are still countries joining the WTO. But I think what you need here is rules, you need trust, and you need to discuss, to talk. So RTT, rules, talk, and trust. And for example, the WTO, but also the Paris Climate Agreement and the COPs coming from them, and the latest one in the UAE, which was very successful as a case in point, that you can get there when you are willing to have a rules-based system, when you are willing to discuss, sit together, like we are doing at this moment, and hammer out the issues, have our differences, and then come to an agreement. And that builds the trust. That's the only way to move forward. And that is why I say again, there is no schism between North and South, there is no schism between multilateralism and the national interest, and parties like my own, the centrist parties, should be much more forcefully put forward that case in point, because it is now the populace saying, oh, multilateralism is crazy, get rid of it, it's yesterday's story. No, you need both sides of the coin, multilateralism and strong nation states.
Bill Gates, finally on health and this round, I think President Kagame and President Petro both mentioned that during the COVID crisis, developing countries, many developing countries, probably most, felt they were treated as second-class citizens of the world. The developed countries got all the vaccines first, they had the technology, and vaccine rates fell far, far behind in many important parts of the world, notably in Africa. Will we do better next time? Are we really set up and determined to treat a global health problem as a global problem? I wrote a lot about this at the time, and I wonder whether we really have learned the lessons.
Well, in some respects, people don't want to talk about the pandemic at this point, and how we build the capacity to do trials where we practice, okay, are we ready? What would we need to do? And then we need to build better tools. For many of these problems where the total amount of money is going to be super limited, and some elections would make the money even more limited than it is today. We have to innovate. And a great example of that is now the factories that make mRNA vaccines, a group in Belgium funded by the foundation can make those very inexpensively. And for me, the issue is not having vaccine factories in magic places. It's having enough capacity in the entire world that we can get vaccines to everyone. Because who you want to discriminate against, if the factories are cheap, you're going to have that capacity. In fact, more vaccines were made in India. We funded Serum 2 months into the pandemic. They created a factory. We had a challenge that those vaccines, which were going to Africa for a period, became unavailable. But that was a South issue that challenged that. We really need to up the dialogue of, given limited resources, where should the grant money go? I would claim that nutrition and vaccines will always rise to the top of that list. And so as we see, is Gavi replenished later this year, it'll show, are we maintaining the very highest impact investment that was ever made? And likewise on the innovation agenda. President Kagame and I were talking about how Rwanda's moving forward on these digital initiatives and making multiple places in the South, including Rwanda, India, and many others, a laboratory where AI healthcare, AI education is done not 5 or 10 years after it's done in the North, but done at the same time. And in fact, given their shortage of doctors, in some sense you could say it should be even faster. And if we can find the right cooperative effort, I think we can surprise people on how quickly we provide benefits there.
So we have, unfortunately, only 5 minutes left. And I know how strict they are, and people want lunch. So you've got a minute each. So what I would like you to focus on, I knew this will be a problem, because there's so much to talk about. In the light of what you've heard, in the view that we have to solve these problems, it's not you're in actual doing things, what is the most important single thing that you want to see happen which will make things better from where you sit? And you have a minute. I apologize. President Kagame.
Well, I'm an optimist as well as a realist, so I see things for what they are. There are problems, and they can be addressed. The underlying importance lies in cooperation, and the people can still cooperate. But we cannot deny the fact that there are differences within nations, whether in the South, but more significant South and the North. There's no question about that. And there is domination, if you will, sometimes. There are dictates that people bring to play into whatever is happening every day. So we can, and these debates have been there for a long time. This is not the first debate about that. So, but that means if such a debate has been there for a long time, it also means the problem is continuing. But we can really address all these matters through cooperation and also looking at the root cause of whatever problem we are talking about.
Thank you very, very much. Your last word on the single most important thing you want to happen, if you could.
Well, let me start by saying that in spite of the numbers I gave of the inverting shares of trade between North and South, we have to acknowledge that there are parts of the world that haven't benefited as much. If we look at least developed countries, their share of trade has been 1% and has remained stagnant. Africa's share of trade has remained also stagnant at 3% or less. So my big wish is, how can the trading system be reformed and moved in such a way that those countries that have not benefited as much, even with these changing shares, can benefit more from the trading system? And how do we do it in such a way that we cooperate and collaborate. And I just want to put a shout out for my own organization. I think Prime Minister Rutte has been doing it mostly. But to say that, yes, we had difficulties at the WTO because developing countries did not see themselves benefiting, and there was this trust issue. At the same time, developed countries feel that some emerging markets are benefiting maybe too much from the system. So what I'd like to see is us coming together as we did at our last ministerial, working in an interdependent way with strategic cooperation to deliver more for those who didn't benefit from the system.
Thank you very much. President Petro, really briefly, you can see the time. Make one powerful, simple point about what you think can be done now.
Me gustaría ver dos cosas.
I would like to see two things. One,
Indudablemente el proyecto de
without doubt, there is a democratic danger in the world, and therefore we have to restore the democratic order in the world. This is a challenge, and currently this is fragmented. We have to restore this order, freedom or liberty, égalité. And all these French principles they don't have the headquarters in Paris, but in South Africa and Africa. And another issue or another point to mention, how we address climate change. The 100 billion from Paris are no longer important. We need 30 times more funds for this. If we manage to establish some sort of policy and to reach an agreement to offset debt for climate action, we could reach this figure. 30 times higher than what was pledged in Paris. And that can be generated with public resources from everywhere in the world, and this can be invested in a major Marshall Plan on climate action in the world so that we can preserve life on the planet.
Mark Rutte.
Obviously, gathered here in Davos, we are very worried about Ukraine, and we are very worried about the Middle East. And at the same time, we are thinking of the energy transition and the need for fighting the warming of our planet, so climate change. And I would hope for two things. One is to reform the multilateral system, and it is tilting too much at this moment to the north. And it has to be incorporating, it should incorporate the fact that the world has changed, including the IMF, including the whole system of development banks. It should tilt more to the south. And secondly, we need to invest in the quality of governance at a national level wherever necessary. And we need to help each other also in that respect.
Bill Gates, very last word.
Okay.
One sentence, if possible.
Well, sadly, I'd say that the resources coming from the north, there's not much upside. And so the idea of using the power of innovation, whether it's in climate or health or in education, and prioritizing properly by listening to what the countries are asking for, what their priorities are, I remain optimistic, and that's partly from the great successes that we can build on.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to summarize except to make 3 points. I know I've already exceeded time, a bit better than the last session, I should say. There's obviously an immense amount of frustration and anger. The system is obviously still very heavily weighted in many ways to the countries of the north. It would be very nice to think we can fix that. We've been in these discussions a lot. We can probably improve it. But I would endorse a very important point made at the end by Bill Gates, that a lot of what we're going to have to do will be being very, very clever in the way we innovate, both in the economy and in our institutions. It's going to be an immensely difficult struggle to manage these problems, and we have to recognize that we have to do almost everything to do so. Thank you very much. I think it's been a wonderful panel, if far too short, and I think a lot of very important points and ideas have been put forward. Please thank them.